1, 2. All right.
Because we are at 2 o'clock now, and so we are ready to rock on this one. Gentlemen, do we have the recording started?
Test. All right.
Okay.
Chestna. Intimate audience today.
They're a scary audience. They're all the way in the back. All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and get this rolling. Thank you for showing up right now. So we have for the next hour the Maginot Line, Common AppSec Anti-Patterns. So Pete Chestna serves as the CISO of North America at Checkmarks, where he provides customers and prospects with practical advice for building successful application security programs. Bringing more than 15 years of direct AppSec practitioner experience, Pete has held roles ranging from developer and development leader to his most recent position as the global head of AppSec for the Bank of Montreal. Over the years, Pete has led organizational transformations from high water to agile to DevOps and from monolith to microservice architectures. I am impressed. He is certified as both a Scrum Master and product owner, stemming from his experience as both an avid practitioner and consultant. Pete has spoken internationally at numerous prominent security and developer conferences, including DevOps Days, All Day DevOps, OWASP, AppSec, and DevSecCon. Pete has been granted 3 patents, enjoys whiskey tourism, astronomy, model rocketry, and listening to Rush in his spare time. That is totally awesome in my book. Thank you very much. Give it up for Pete.
All right, thank you. So this is my first presentation in years in front of a live audience. I'm super excited to be here and happy to get going. So I'm happy for anyone to raise their hand, ask a question during this. If you got something you want to say or something you want to talk about, I'm happy to dig into that. Already well introduced here. Really leaning into my developer roots. I am of Tribe Developer. So a little bit about Checkmarks. Our booth is right outside the door here. We are an application security testing company, so we provide things like SAST and DAST and software composition analysis. So if you build applications, and most companies do, our company can help you test them and release them securely. I like to start this particular talk with the difference between InfoSec and AppSec. And if you think about InfoSec, this is the picture that comes to my mind. We have done an amazing job of building perimeters and strengthening the outside-in defenses for our companies. So it looks very much like a castle. And that's really the way InfoSec has been built up over time. We spend so much of our budgets on this kind of defense, whether it be endpoint or firewall, etc. Now, is anyone here a historian or know very much about World War II? So the premise of this talk, as I thought about this, was the Maginot Line. So in World War I, of course, Germany invades France, and they're like, damn it, I don't want that to happen again. So post-World War I, they said, well, we're going to fix this. We are going to build up a wall between us and Germany. They called it the Maginot Line. And you can see here on the map, that strong red line there, that's where they built it. And what did Germany do in World War II? They went around it. I mean, okay, fine. This is where the wall is, and I'm just going to skirt around the wall. And this is how I think about application security. Application security, we do a decent job of building up our fortifications in certain places for certain applications. We don't cover the whole waterfront for a variety of reasons. The attackers just go around that, whether that's social engineering to gather creds or password spraying or any of those things. It's about covering the whole waterfront and making sure that you have that solid line of defense. So this talk is all about anti-patterns. The things that I've seen in my time, I've seen hundreds of application security programs, and this is really about the things that I see go wrong and how to fix it. And the first one, the one that I include in all of these talks, is about the goal of your AppSec program. So I'd like some brave volunteer to tell me what they think the goal of application security either is or should be. Yes, sir. Enable the business. I like it. Anyone else? It's okay, don't be shy. Come on now. There's not that many of you in here. It's okay, we're a family. No, sorry, I keep wandering on that camera. So I commonly hear things like release secure applications or protect my company from a breach or protect the brand. And those are all interesting, and those are all good outcomes. So in my application security program, that's definitely what I want. I want to have those things happen. I want to protect my company from a breach. I want to protect the brand. I want to release secure applications. But that's not the goal, in my mind, of application security. We'll start with cost to fix. The later you find it, the more expensive it is to fix. And this isn't because the individual fix is any more expensive anywhere along the line. There are a lot of things that contribute and compound this problem. If you think about, for instance, if I make a decision, let's say I'm building a house and I lay out the foundation, and then when I hit the second floor, I realize there was a problem in the foundation. Well, there were a whole bunch of decisions that sprang from where that foundation was built and how it was built that I have to now go revisit. I might have to tear down that first floor to get after the problem in the foundation. It's about that compounding error. It's like, I made a mistake, and then people made decisions based on that mistake, et cetera, et cetera. It's also about who's doing those fixes. Developer comes in, they write some code, and then it's in the ecosystem, and then maybe that developer isn't available, so I have someone else come in to make that fix. I can tell you, as a developer, it is much harder to read code than it is to write code. Because you have to be in someone's head. How did they think about this problem? Why did they write it this way? If you've ever tried to debug somebody else's code, it can be very frustrating. So if you think about it, the farther left you do it, the closer it is to the person that did it, and they can get back in their own headspace around fixing that problem. The other problem is, well, when do we test? And in typical fashion, and this is legacy, but still exists today. Now, we think about the assurance scan as that final check, but sometimes in companies, that's the only check. So we got our release candidate, we've gone through QA, it's time to check out security. And then we find, 100 things. Now, of course, as security practitioners, we know, get those 100 things, we'll be lucky to get 10. So we go to the team with those 10, and they're like, we don't have time, we're releasing in a week, what can we do here? And maybe you get one or two of the critical ones, but you never get everything you need, and the things sit in the backlog otherwise. So when we test it that late, we're finding lots of stuff that we wish we never found, and now we're screwed because of when we're doing that testing. So if the engine's already on the plane, what's it going to take to fix that? Rip the whole thing apart, take it off the plane, and revisit all those changes. So in AppSec, I think about developers and how they write code. So as a developer, I know that I make mistakes because human. Computers don't write this code, we do. And even when computers start writing the code, they're going to write the code based on what we told them to write it, right? So there's still going to be mistakes. So for any amount of time that I sit and develop, I'm going to make a mistake or mistakes. So we need to find it, and we're going to triage it. And this is a meeting with people, usually Scrum Master, project lead, etc. So there are people in a room, so that's expensive. It's also calendar time. So when do we do this? At what level are we introspecting these things? So these things build up in Jira. Then we go through and we triage them, and we decide which things we're going to fix and which things we're not. If this is something that we're going to fix, who are we going to assign it to? Again, go back to that problem of who wrote the code and who's going to fix it. So it's going to take longer if you give it to someone that didn't write that code in the first place. Then I got to retest it, and then I can start developing again. In DevOps or DevSecOps, or in proper Agile fashion even, if you think about what the definition of done. So in Agile, there's a term called the definition of done that says, when I pick up a piece of work and I'm going to go do this work, what are all the things I need to do to say it's done before I put it down? Because when you put it down, you're supposed to leave it. Rework is the enemy of Agile and DevOps because it means you got to go backwards and redo some stuff. So if you think about a developer developing some code, and now hopefully, and we'll get to this in a second, they're finding and fixing things on their own inside of that work. So I'm running that tooling, and this is the parlance of shift left. So if I'm checking it while I'm doing it, it's fresh in my head, it's fresh in my fingers, then I can do that. And then I don't have all of that extra work up here. I can just continue to work. And in the way DevOps works at scale and at pace is you think about this as single piece flow. In DevOps, what you're supposed to do in highly functioning teams, pick up that piece of work. When it's done, it gets released. Through a variety of methods, all of the assurance scans still need to be there. So what I'm saying here is this find fix thing, that's what the developer is doing. It never gets you away from assurance scans. You are always going to do those last SaaS checks, and you're going to do your DAST, and you're going to have pen tests and those things. But all of the stuff should have been found before. This is just making sure, this is trust but verify. Thank you, Ronald Reagan. Trust but verify that the developers actually did what they were supposed to do. All right. Based on that argument, someone want to give me a new version of what we think the AppSec program should be. What is the goal of our AppSec programs, or what should they be? What could they be? Be brave, it's okay. Yes, sir. Thank you. That's an outcome, yes, but how? What do we want to see here that we're not seeing in the second case that we're not seeing in the first case? Yes. To what end? Yes, love it. Can we go a little further? very good. So I think there's a step further. And the step further is if you think about easy things like SQL injection, it is possible to write it right the first time. It doesn't cost you any more to write it as a parameterized query than it does to concatenate a bunch of strings together. In fact, from an engineering perspective, it's way more maintainable to do it the first way than the second, and much more cumbersome and error-prone to do it the second way. So what if we took our tooling and trained our developers to do it right the first time? In other words, it comes out of my fingers secure, and I never have to find and fix it. That's the panacea that I shoot for in my AppSec program, is to say, hey, I want to teach them, and this is kind of the discussion that we had earlier, I want to teach them how to do it right so that way we're not making the mistakes, because that eliminates all the rework. So for some set of things that we can teach them, now you can't do it for everything, but there's a certain set of well-known things that we can measure, by the way, that say, it came out of here secure, so I never have to think about it. And again, the cost of those is no more expensive. It's the cost of doing the top, of going back and fixing it afterwards. So, how do we get there? First one is to understand how the sausage is made. You have secure or application development, software engineering is a craft. I take a great deal of pride in the software that I write. And anyone that's written software, I believe, has that same feeling. You want people to look at your code and say, wow, that was awesome. In the same way that security practitioners have that pride. So learning about whether it's waterfall or agile or DevOps, what is it that they struggle with? We want to understand that. What is the goal for them? How are they measured? And we'll get more into that in a second. Talk about their challenges. You need to provide them help that helps. So if the way that you do security is we're going to do manual code review for everything and we're going to do pen test, well, okay, those are valid ways to secure an application. They're extremely expensive and stop development in their tracks. That's not help that helps. So we have to figure out what tooling they need and how to integrate it and how to provide them the right training to get them there. So we have to have those discussions. So to the tooling aspect, measurement is critical. If you think about going to the doctor and getting your blood pressure checked. So I had high blood pressure, but you go to the doctor, let's say you went once a year, and it takes your blood pressure, and it's high. Okay, well, what do you know about your blood pressure at that point? You really know nothing. It's one data point across 365 days that says, today my blood pressure is high. Now maybe, walking out of the house, I got in an argument with my wife, and the dog, ate my homework, and I went to the diner and had home fries with, 2 pounds of salt on it. Guess what? My blood pressure is going to be high. But it isn't normally high, or maybe it's not. So think about how frequently we test to be able to understand the ebb and flow of, are we getting better, are we getting worse? And if you're not doing that more frequently, and think about that monthly, weekly, daily, to say, hey, every day we see this steady decrease in things, in bad things coming into the code base, or steady increase. Okay, then we clearly have a problem. If it's spiky and it's up and down all over the place, then maybe we need to shrink that time frame even more to figure out why we struggle and how we struggle. So to that end, you need to provide them the right kind of tooling that gives you the telemetry and information you need to be able to ask those questions. There were AppSec programs where I would go and visit with people that became my friends to talk about their AppSec programs. We'd sit and geek out over the dashboards they created. We'd do a bunch of measurements and say, hey, I wonder why that happened. Or what do you think caused this? And what if we changed that? And then I'd come back the next quarter and we'd see whether or not that had an impact. Training is also key, but here's the problem. What we do with training is we say, hey, here's 8 hours worth of AppSec training or security training. Is it helping? I don't know. Is it the right training? Have no idea. I was talking with a CISO of one of the major airlines, and we were talking about their AppSec program, and he said, hey, you know what? I have AppSec training. I'm like, awesome. Does it work? He goes, I don't know. Well, shouldn't we? If we have the right tooling that gives us the right telemetry, or we're measuring it frequently, we're going to see what the developers struggle with. We'll be able to create bespoke training because we don't have all day. We can't take up all their time. It won't be allowed. So what if we thought about what's the most important thing for us to get after? Because if you train them on 10 things, they're not going to remember any of them. If you train them on one, over time, they're going to get that, and they need to hear it multiple times in multiple ways. Then you can measure that improvement with the tooling that we already have in place. So think of this as a feedback cycle, which is what DevOps is all about. I'm going to feed that back and say, okay, I see that they have a problem. I'm going to train them on that specific problem, and then I'm going to measure whether or not they got better. Are those things getting fixed faster? Are they producing less of them over time? So again, the longer you measure, you can see every time there's a SQL injection. Okay, fine. So I start to do that, and then I see SQL injection levels off and then starts to taper, and they're fixing them really fast. Awesome. That's effective. Now let's do the next thing. We can't boil the ocean, so think about that. Also, helping them fix what they find. If you leave them to their own devices, it might take them 2, 3, 4 times to actually get it right for some of these harder vulns. If you can't do it, can you provide them some assistance? You don't want them out on the web just going out there and saying, well, how do I do this? How do I fix this? We want to get the fix right the first time, and we want to help train them at that same time. Can you sit side by side with them, explain why this vulnerability is bad? What is SQL injection? What can it cause? Why am I worried about this? And then take that, help them fix it, and then that gets that in their head. So the next time they sit down and they're going to code a SQL query, they're like, wait a minute. Yesterday I was sitting and fixing one of these, so hey, the parameterized query, way to go. And we do it right, and now we can move on. Now we have more time to work with other teams. So at the bank, I was responsible for 2,000 applications. You can imagine how many people that entailed. I don't have time to work on all of them. So I got to stack rank them, and I got to start somewhere and move other places. We could talk about the maturity of the teams, which teams are doing okay, which teams are really not doing okay. But I'd like to be able to get at more of that waterfront, but there's only so many people that I can hire and have doing those things. Okay. Second one, security mandate. Love this one. Who has a security mandate in their company? So I did at the bank. There were rules, but there are always exceptions. AppSec programs typically have a couple of outcomes. They either look like this. Yeah, I got a gate. So what? There are well-horned paths around it. I'm just going to avoid it. I can get around it either by an exception process. So we had one of those. So largely, people could say, oh, well, I don't have time, it's too hard, it'll take too long, any myriad of things, and then the business would decide to accept that risk. So what good is that gate? Now, for some applications, we did have a hard gate where you couldn't get those exceptions, but then it looks like this. And this isn't good for the business. It's not good for you because your name is tied to why that product didn't ship on time. And who wants that? I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be responsible for that. So as you think about your AppSec program and how you do it, these are important things to think about. I was talking with a CISO for a testing provider. This is a medical testing provider, a big one in the US. And we were sitting in a meeting, and he said, hey, he wanted to get my approval. He's like, I am going to enforce breaking of the build on my developers. I'm like, well, that's interesting, But for anyone in this room, if I said I'm going to enforce this on you, how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel good? Is this the picture we want for application security? We're the cops. We're going to stop you from being bad. Because the what you get from that is this: resistance. They're going to find those paths around it. They're going to find the exception process, and they're going to use it all the time. Or they're going to do compliance, which is like the worst word in AppSec or InfoSec in general. Compliance means I'm going to do the bare minimum. I'm just going to squeak myself over that line. So if I can only fix 2 out of 20, that's what I'm going to do. Now I'm compliant, let me go. If we think about what it takes to get them to embrace this, what I said to him is, well, what if we thought about this differently? Instead of enforcing on it, what if they embraced it? What if they came to you and said, hey, I want to break the build. I care about the security of our application, and I want it to be of high quality. Isn't that a better world? I'd rather live in that world where we actually feel like partners instead of adversaries. So how do we get to this? This one's a tough one, and most of the time in most of my talks, I talk way more about people and process than I ever do about tooling. We got lots of tooling. It finds lots of stuff. Absolutely true. But at the end of the day, what you want is better results. You want more secure outcomes. Getting there requires all the people that do the work to do work differently. So, number one, relationships. It is so easy, if you don't know people by name, to say it's us versus them. Those damn developers slowing me down. The security people putting in those roadblocks, dropping the gate on us. We have to talk to each other and work together on this to say, hey, what is this problem and how do we get after it? When I talk about, so I went to a healthcare provider, or even at my bank when I talked to developers at the bank. They were employees of the bank. They used the bank. They were customers. So when you have these discussions, think about making this personal. If you work at a medical device company that implants devices, well, if they think about the customer as just some person that I don't know, how much do I care? If I think about that person being my mother, my daughter, my brother, me, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe I should pay a little more attention to the security of this product to make sure that I don't cause a death in my own family or negative complications. So if you can make it personal and connect it with them, they're protecting, in the bank's case, the money of themselves and their family, etc. So think about that. Make it personal. Back to this one. This is an easy one. We covered it. We've got to understand how it's made to make sure that we're helping them. This is the biggest one. This is the thing that drives us apart, that makes us pull in the opposite direction. Accountability, and more specifically, mutual accountability. If you talk to developers, they think that security is responsible for security. If you talk to security, they say, well, I don't write the code. The developers are responsible for it. So we're pointing like this. When we used to do enterprise software in our own data centers, operations gets paid and gold on a glassy, smooth surface. I want production to be up all the time. I don't want to have any ruffles. I don't want it to be slow or cumbersome or anything. I don't need to negatively impact our customers or our business. That's a great goal. I don't disagree with it. But the developers are paid to change everything extremely fast. Well, if you walked up to a glassy, smooth lake and dropped even a little pebble in it, what happens? Ripples. You can't avoid it. You can't change. You can't impact a change in the system without having the system be disrupted. So by having those two people paid, or those two groups paid to be pulling in the opposite direction, they're hurting each other. If you think about aligning those goals to unplanned outages and a high rate of availability where they're working together and they're both paid for that. So think about application developers not just being paid for shipping software quickly. That's a good goal. How about we ship secure software quickly? Now, if that's part of how I get paid, if that's part of my bonus, and there are reports generated on that, I'm going to start asking security for help. I like my bonus. I'd like to get it all. Can you help me? That opens up that door. You've got the relationship. Now we've got the accountability. Now let's chat. Okay, the next anti-pattern. And this is an unfortunate byproduct of budgets. I don't have enough money to spread across all of my applications. So I'm just going to protect the critical ones. Well, that's an interesting approach. I don't disagree with it as the first thing out of your head. But if you think about how some of these breaches occurred, like the Target breach, the Target breach was a result of social engineering to an HVAC provider of corporate Target. They got their credentials for a billing system that was built to charge back the HVAC services that they provided to the Target stores. Who, in their right mind, would talk about that application as being critical? But if you understand that that application sits in the same network segments as your Target.com, well, now we've got a problem. So think about that as a problem to say, well, maybe that is an important application, and how do I make sure that I can reduce that risk? Think about the rigging that's holding these things up. How heavy are those containers? I don't know. What's in them? No idea. Is it important? Is it fragile? I can't tell you. Would I want to stand under it? I don't know. I really want to inspect that rigging and understand it. So as you think about your AppSec program, you've got to look at the waterfront. You've got to look at everything. Now, of course, you can't get to it all at once. And yes, we do need to prioritize. But the end goal has to be, I need to understand how these things are interconnected to each other. For instance, you need to do threat analysis. You need to look at it and say, what am I afraid of? And based on that, now I can decide on spend. And now I can decide on which application first and which application next, because the order might be really different. Because if I can go solve that Target problem by network segmentation and making sure that app is harmless to the rest of my infrastructure, okay, I can pay attention to that later or never. That's okay, that's a risk that you take. But while it sits in that same network segment and can talk to everything else and get inside of my company and release corporate information and gather customer data, well, I really want to be careful of that. Think about that threat modeling and look at your application teams. There are ways to do maturity modeling on them and understand where they are from a maturity standpoint to say, hey, these are more mature than those. And this is all in that more important, less important task that you've got to do. So you think about 2,000 applications. Yeah, there are some that move money. Those are going to be at the top of my list. But I also, inside of that, there are many applications that move money. All right, well, let's look at the teams. If I take a look at my tooling now and say, well, which ones are struggling more than others? Which ones are creating more vulnerabilities and not really fixing them ever? I can go to those first. So again, more important, less important. And that's really how we need to work, because we're never going to have enough time. We're never going to have enough resource. We don't want our application security program to look like this. For some portion of your application portfolio, I guarantee it is that. You don't know anything about it. Now, the tooling has gotten cheap enough that you should be able to shake that out and say, hey, let's get a snapshot of everything just so I have some picture in my head. I need some data to go on. And then talk about that maturity model and talk about how do we move them up the maturity model, understanding which teams are responsible for which applications and what are we going to do about it. We talk about our education program and the tooling and the training. Can we do something corporate-wide? Again, once you get that information initially on what they're struggling with or what's in your application inventory, which again, if you're not measuring frequently, if you onboard applications, let's say I onboarded those 2,000 applications at the bank, there's a ton of stuff in there. Question is, how long was it there? Are the developers that wrote those vulnerabilities still even at the bank? Is that the problem that I have, or I have some different problem? Now, I certainly want to go address those vulns at some rate, at some pace, but I can't do it all ever. There's no way on God's green earth that in the span of your lifetime or anyone else's, that you're going to fix every single vulnerability that you've ever found. It's just not going to happen because you're creating them as you go. So think about that as you build out your AppSec program. You need to select the right metrics. Now, there's lots that I used. I think about scanned versus unscanned. So as I look at my application inventory, and that's an important one, do you have an application inventory? Once you do, what do you know about it? Have you done pen testing? Have you done DAST? Have you done SAST? Have you done SCA? Do you have any information at all about these applications? So if you don't know anything about them, well, what's the risk rating of that app? And how do I think about prioritizing that to get scanned so I can see and have some picture in my head of what that looks like? Another thing is to not include everything. So a lot of the security tooling provides you everything that it sees. That includes information, low priority stuff, mediums, high, critical. As you think about managing these, well, I'm not going to care about informational and low. And I can tell you as a developer, if you think about even compilers, I had developers that would look at the compiler output and any noise that it made at all, any squeak, got addressed at perhaps great cost. Maybe it was very cumbersome for them to suppress that warning in a real way, but added zero value to the application. I don't want them spending time on that. And yeah, I'd love them to fix all the vulnerabilities, but let's talk about what our policy is for the company based upon the risk of that application and what it does to say, here's what I want you to see. Because I don't want you to cherry pick the things to fix. I want you to fix these. These are the ones we got to get after. So we have to think about that. Find versus fix rate. How fast are they creating them and how fast are they fixing them? Or are they fixing them at all? Do you have time frames where mediums might have a very long time to go and fix, and then highs have maybe a couple weeks, and criticals have a week or less? Are they fixing them at that rate? How can we lean into that? How do we look at that number? So you have to have metrics that make sense to you in how you work with your teams and how you prioritize this work. And is this automated too, by the way? So as you have this tooling, as you look at tooling, you don't want people running this. People forget to run it, or they run it wrong, or they misconfigure it, etc. Let's talk about having this thing put in there and measuring, have that meter across the code as it goes in all the time. Reporting to the people that are gold for these things. So again, we talked about mutual accountability. And by the way, it's not just the developer and the security. I want this to go all the way up. I want CISO and CIO to have those goals, and that those goals get reported on in a transparent fashion to the CEO who's responsible to the board. And then you have to think about all the segmentation you need to do across business units, across management chains. How do we break this up so each individual person knows how they stack against each other and where they're struggling and failing and how they can ask for help? So we need it to be fair and transparent. It needs to be per application, per team. Again, as we think about the maturity level of those teams, we want to be able to dive in deeply into this. Gamification. This is a big push inside of AppSec training now, where people react to that. They want to be better. They want to be measured as better than their peer. And to do that, we put in this kind of gamification aspect. So if we can do that and we can publish these things more publicly, better for us. It gives you the right results. Okay. Next one. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're not bad. Free lunches. Open source. Open source. So this is what I would consider probably the biggest problem in applications today. And there are lots of reasons for that. Most of your application today, anything that you've written in the last 5 to 10 years, is open source for the majority of it. 80 to 95% of the code that you ship today is open source. And if you're using just SAST and DAST, what do you know about those open source phones? What do you know about those CVEs that are sitting inside of there as a ticking time bomb, waiting for someone to just unleash a script against a segment of the internet, find your app, send it a package that does some unsafe deserialization, runs the code inside of your network data center, and now owns you. And now you've been breached, and who knows when you're going to find it. Because of the amount of code and the fact is that we didn't write it and we don't own it, that is a huge, huge risk that I don't take lightly, and it was really scary to me. And the point is that it is free, technically, but not like a free lunch, like what you guys got today. It's not a free lunch. You're not eat it and done. It is more like a free puppy. There's care and feeding. I got to walk the puppy. I got to feed the puppy. I got to take the puppy to the doctor. Over time, you have a responsibility. When you take on a puppy, you have a responsibility to that puppy that you don't have to that lunch. I could throw it in the trash and who cares? But that's not what we can do with our open source. We have to think about it. So that care and feeding takes on a number of different problems. Some of this is around, how do I upgrade this, or do I upgrade it, or do I ever look at it? Because what I could tell you is that developers integrate it and they abandon it. When they find a component that they need to use in their application to leverage, to build out the functionality that they're providing to customers, I found it, I put it in, I integrated it, the function works, I'm done. I can walk away, I don't have to think about it ever again. Unfortunately, that software is going to move over time. Developers continue to write new releases, they make it better, they make it more secure. And the problem is, the longer you go, the worse the problem is from a complexity standpoint. So if we go back to the beginning of the talk when we talked about the cost to fix, if I'm talking about moving from one minor release, let's say I go from a 2.1 to a 2.2, there's probably not a lot of change there, a couple of little bug fixes, and I'm done. But if I go from a 2.1 to a 4.5, there may be breaking changes in there. There may be things that I accounted for before and wrote the code for how it worked that don't work that way anymore. So now, well, crap, I can't just say plug it in and go. I now have to go back and stepwise walk through it and test it and step and step and step and step. So it gets more complex over time. So you need to think about that. Do you have a way to account for that? It's not a security problem until it is. And here's a great example. In Struts, which one of my former companies used, we integrated Struts at version 4 and then walked away from it. We had a lot of work to do. We had a lot of things to put into the product, and we didn't need to go after that. By the time the Apache Commons Collections vulnerability showed up with the unsafe deserialization, they were in version 7. So some of the problem is they don't go back and fix version 4. It's not like I can patch version 4. They fixed it in version 7. Major versions that, by the way, had you repackage your application. You had to change the way that you passed your authentication and authorization information between Tomcat and JBoss. That all changed. It was a multi-person year effort to move us from version 4 to version 7. Wow. It was a decade from the time that we integrated that till that vulnerability was found. But it was there the whole time. You just don't know it. So when you do this and you allow it to drift away from current, you are increasing your technical debt at a rate that you will not be able to pay back when it comes time. Yes, sir.
One question. Do you have projects like that where people are using open source and they abandon them, right? And you build your scans into your DevOps pipeline.
Mhm.
There's no pipeline being run because there's no code movement. So how do you detect those?
Right. So the tooling in this area typically, it typically takes a snapshot of what you use. Not the, it gives you the vulns, but it gives you the vulns at that snapshot in time. Most of the vendors in this space say, hey, I know that you use Struts version 4, and then it says, well, okay, today there's no vulns. When vulns are located, they come back and say, by the way, you have this problem now. So if that code doesn't move, the vendor space still says, we know you had this, and when this vuln comes up, we come and tell you about it. So it's different than your typical static analysis. So for static, it doesn't work that way. If a vendor adds a new CWE into their scanning, you have to rescan the code because all of those things were found at the time that you scanned it. But in the case of open source, you take a snapshot of what they had and then say, okay, based on this is like doing a recall. So I go to the store, I buy some bacon, it's got a lot number on it. Now, I get an email that says, hey, there's a recall on this brand of bacon, and here's the lot number you can go find. So that's kind of the way it works with open source.
But you see, my thought is if a tree falls in the forest, who hears it?
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Because if you're not in a pipeline, there's no developer hearing it.
Right. Well, and in fact,
If it's abandoned code.
well, it's abandoned. What I mean by abandoned in this case is that I don't bother to go back and see, is there a newer version available? Or, do I need to upgrade now? Or are there vulnerabilities in it, et cetera? So it's not, it's still in the source base, so it gets scanned every time, so I still see it from that perspective. It's more that the developers think that they don't have to worry about it anymore. That's that free lunch. It's like, it did my thing.
But the scan and awareness and outside of what the developers see,
Right.
because it's out of the pipeline.
Well, yeah, it depends on how you structure it. So we'll get into those fixes in a second. So the point here is it ages not like wine, but more like milk, right? It gets more sour over time. It does not get better with age. So as you think about open source, you need to think about the reputation of that open source. Who's contributing? Is it actively being maintained? So you and I talked about that before. When you look at these libraries over time, there's a big peak and spike, and there's lots of activity, and lots of people are using it. Sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of applications use these libraries. Or thousands and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in some cases of libraries use your library. So these things get pulled into this big tangled web. So you need to think about, are we still on something that we should be on? Do we need to migrate off of this? Do I need to go from Log4j to Logback? Yes, at some point you do. You also need to have policies that have strong guardrails around how far you're able to drift, whether that be time-based or version-based or some combination of the two. Development needs to understand that this is part of good hygiene. It's like brushing your teeth. It will degrade over time. The cost only goes up. It never goes down. The complexity only goes up. It does not go down. And if you allow them to drift forever, then when I hit that problem of that Apache Commons collections, and I've got 2 man-years worth of effort, now what? I have no choice at this point but to pay the bill or pull the app or do some huge heavy lift under duress. It's cheap to do it along the way. So we need to build that into our policies. Next is thinking about the knowing your inventory. So this is first of all knowing your application inventory. And then once you know that, knowing what open source you're using, those SBOMs. I need to have a bill of materials for all of my applications so I know what I have so that if something comes up, I can quickly go look. CVE comes in, I see it on my news feed. That looks bad. Let me go look. And I want to be able to look at that and say, what library is that in? Does it affect me? Okay, it does. Which application? Which team? How do I go to them? How do I connect all those dots? You should be doing tabletop exercises on this. CVE gets announced. Now what? Go. Find the gaps in your process to be able to tie those things together, because if these are critical enough and you are vulnerable to it and there's an exploit and that exploit is something that they can automate, they're gonna. Lastly, it's about the prioritization of your work. So that, again, those discussions around more important, less important, the maturity of my teams, the risk in those applications, the number of vulns, how well are those applications do at fixing things, how long is the tail on that dog? You have to think about all that stuff. So these are things that we need to be planful for, because if we react in the event of a breach or in the event of a CVE notification, then we're not really running the shop very well. So we need to get ahead of these things and understand them. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We have no questions on the Hoover app. If anyone here has a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over.
And I'll be out at the booth too afterwards, so if you want to come find me there, I am happy to chat. All right. Thank you for attending, and I hope I provided help that helps.
Thank you very much, sir.